Hello, I'm Brian Fox. This is my channel, I Hate Rock Music, and today I'm going to do another in a series of I Still Dream About Great Lost Rock albums. And today's a Great Lost Rock album, and I should point out, a lot of times it's not so much we have an album that's lost. A lot of times, like with this, it's a lost opportunity for a great album. In this case, it's the band High Tide. And I've done a separate video on them. They're one of my favorite bands of that period. Completely unique, completely original guitar, bass, drums, violin lineup that just has to be heard to be believed. And their first album is a complete wall of sound. It's just so completely over the top. And then their second album came out and had a lot of really interesting influences. There was only a couple of songs on it, really long, evolved, almost suites with a lot of added instrumentation, keyboards and mandolin and acoustic guitars and the like. And it had folk influences and jazz influences, and so they kind of really toned down on the second record, although I don't want to overstate that. There's still some pretty brutal prog psych rock of the period. But the intricacy of the material they were working on in that period was really wonderful, and it turns out there was almost a third album, and they were definitely turning in that direction, and it's really unfortunate because they certainly had enough material, and the material that we have is available on a couple of records that came out. One is called Precious Cargo, and it's basically them putting on 2-inch reels of them rehearsing, and it's been documented they were recording at Puddington Studios, which was later used for demos for Led Zeppelin, and the whole Rustic Hinge group did all their recording at Puddington. And so we have this, and it's somewhat low quality. It's hard to really tell just how impressive it was, but it's clear enough that we get a good indication of the direction the band was heading. And it shows that had they done a third album in 1972, it would have been a great addition to their catalog. It shows the same complexity, perhaps a little bit more, and it shows that they were still doing material that was full-on, full band with a lot of energy and a lot of angst and incredible guitar work. And the original band was still together in 1971, and so if they'd recorded an album, it would have come out probably in early 1972. And we've got one official, semi-official, one of the reissue CDs. There's a track called Ice Age, which is a short, brooding little semi-acoustic piece, but it just shows that the variety and diversity that they were encompassing in their work by the second album would have continued. I still dream of a third High Tide album, and the material that we have shows that it would have been a great album. And what I mean by that is we have a really huge amount of material that they were working on, so they definitely have enough material to do a third album. The song Ice Age, there's a great, really loud one reminiscent of their first album called Rock Me on Your Wave, a tune called Movie Madness, Exploration, Blood Lagoon, Quest, In Flight, Unearth, Static in the Attic, The Ballad of Morris Mill, Icarus, Phoenix, and Unhinged, and All of One Race. So there's plenty of material there for them to have done a third album. And the other interesting thing about that period is the original band obviously existed into 1971. So the first album came out in 1969, the second one in 1970. And so the original band was still playing together in 1971. And the CD album Open Season came out, and it proves the existence of the band in 1971 with the original lineup. So some of those tunes I mentioned, we definitely have demos of them from 1971. But there's obviously a transition going on. One of the more fascinating nuggets I came across recently was an interview with Charles Hayward from Quiet Sun and This Heat. And of course, Quiet Sun existed in Canterbury in 1970 to 1972, right around this period. And Charles Hayward says that he played with High Tide for a while, so that would have been fantastic to hear High Tide material of Charles Hayward, but none of that's available. But that said, there's a second edition of the band that started in 1971. So obviously, in 1971, the original band made a transition to a new band with Tony Hill on guitar, Android Funnel on guitar, Peter Pavley on bass and cello, and Draken Thieker on drums. And on some of the tracks, there's a violin player named Dave Tomlin. So basically a complete new lineup except for Tony Hill and Peter Pavley, and interestingly enough, 2 guitars. So once again, that really intrigues me to have heard a third album by High Tide that was 2 guitars. It's not like you need 2 guitars with somebody like Tony Hill, but I would really have been curious to see what kind of intricacies and interplay they would have had on a record with 2 guitars. And the other thing that's telling about this lineup, um, first of all, Draken Thieker. So of course, after High Tide broke up, most of the members of High Tide commingled with the band Rustic Hinge, and I did a separate video on Rustic Hinge, one of the strangest bands ever in the UK. Fortunately, we have some material by them, and so Draken Thieker came along, and then Tony Hill ended up working with Draken Thieker for many, many, many years after that. But the most intriguing thing, of course, is that this band with the 2 guitar lineup, High Tide, existed from 1971 to 1974. And once again, we have some tracks on Open Season that feature that lineup. I think there's about 3 or 4 pieces on there. I'll put all this stuff below if you want to check it out, what the possibilities were for a 4th or a 3rd High Tide album by the original lineup and then the second lineup. Because even if I'd gotten a 3rd album with the revamped lineup, I'd still be just as excited because the material was so amazing, and the second lineup sounds pretty interesting too. So from 71 to 74, and they're still plugging away in 1976. So apparently, High Tide kind of really chugged along, trying to get back and put something together, make something. But for me, the big lost opportunity is everything was in place for a 3rd High Tide album in 1971, and at least we have the demos. But oh man, I would have loved to hear a full-fledged, completely fleshed out High Tide 3rd album, and that's why I still dream about it. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.